Amiga 500 Plus with PiStorm, or more accurately, Amiga 500 Plus with PiStorm running Emu68. Or to be even more accurate again, it's an Amiga 500 Plus with a PiStorm running Emu68 that achieves a sysinfo speed of 833 MIPS. So that is one really fast Amiga. But since we're in the middle of DOScember, it got me thinking just how fast of an IBM compatible could a really fast Amiga emulate. If you remember last year, we took a look at a bit of software called PC Task. In fact, it was that very Amiga 1200 that we were running it on. That machine has a 40 MHz 030 accelerator in it, getting around 9 MIPS or so in sysinfo. Now, the PC emulation was really good, albeit a bit slow. But this thing, with all that power behind it provided by the Raspberry Pi, well, I just can't help but wonder just how fast of an IBM compatible could we emulate. And yes, I do see the irony that the Raspberry Pi is running an ARM CPU, which itself is emulating a 68K CPU for the Amiga, 68040 to be precise. And then that emulated processor is emulating a completely different system. This is just going to be for a bit of fun. Let's see just how fast this goes. And so this is my RTG desktop coming out of the PiStorm running Emu68. We have plenty of memory to play with, 256 megabytes in total, and that lightning fast 040 processor being emulated. So PC Task. Well, just before I open that, I can't ignore the elephant in the room, or well, the icons on the desktop, can I? AmiQuake. Yes, we can run Quake on this. Now, while this isn't the focus of this video, it would be poor of me not to even just show this very quickly. And if I just run demo 1, well, I think you'll agree with me that 51.3 frames per second is nothing short of impressive. So that just goes to prove that the emulated Amiga processor has plenty of power behind it. But will the emulated Amiga processor be able to emulate a PC? So this is more or less just PC Task as it was on the 1200. In fact, all I've done for now is just copy those files across from the 1200 onto the SD card in the Raspberry Pi. Just a couple of changes to mention. This drive I'm now pointing towards DF1 rather than DF0, and that's just because DH0 in here is a Gotek, and rather I'll need actual disks to transfer stuff into the emulator, so easier to use DH1 and I suppose DH2 as well, since with those we can use real 720k disks. Processor will leave at 286, graphics adapter will just leave on VGA. But if we go into advanced video options, well, you can see in here that we can set the video mode. Now previously it was set to PAL high res. That gives us a resolution of 640 by 200. But because we have RTG available to us, we can select an RTG screen mode. I've set one up here, just 640 by 200 again, and just 8-bit color, 256 colors, that's plenty. In fact, that matches VGA. So let's just start. That booted very quickly. I didn't speed that up. I didn't edit anything out. That booted almost instantly. In fact, so quick we couldn't even read that splash screen. The emulator is running MS-DOS version 5. Bad command or file name, I have no idea what that's about. Something funny going on here. What is all that garbage? That's strange. Let's just see, Control-Alt-Delete. Bad command or file name. And all the garbage is back. Don't really understand that. Maybe something funny happened when I transferred things from one Amiga to another. But look, regardless of that, let's see how fast this is going to perform. So if we go into the BMarks folder, the benchmarks, and in here I have LM60. That video speed test looks about the same to me as it did on the 1200. And yes, at 128 characters per millisecond, that is actually slightly slower. I didn't expect that. I thought the RTG screen mode would have been a bit faster. But regardless of that, check that out. CPU, it is off the end of the scale, and this computer performs like a 96 megahertz AT. That is certainly fast. LM60 sees the emulated CPU as a 286 with a clock of 512 megahertz. Well, I think we can't ignore that. That is absolutely flying along. But there's also some games on here. And if you remember, we tried to run the Monkey Island demo. It did run at an absolute snail's pace. How's it going to run here? Oh, look at that. I did not expect that now. Whatever screen mode that this game has put us into has forced those graphics out of the RGB port on the back of the Amiga. It's not using the RTG. This all looks pretty good so far. And that sounded fine. Did that sound a little bit slow, maybe? Yeah, no, the game is running really well. And certainly you would expect it to. Although I'm not so sure it's running 96 megahertz 286 well. It does still seem to be a little bit of slowdown, and that might be caused by the lack of speed in the graphics. Can we take a mint? We can indeed. So I think you'll agree with me that is absolutely flying along. What I think we'll do is I'm going to take the SD card out of the PiStorm, stick that into the PC, and we'll transfer the newer version of PC Task onto that. I think it's version 4 point something, but more importantly, that newer version, well, it allows us to try and emulate a 486. I'd just be interested to see how well that runs on our uber fast A500. Well, it's a couple of days later, and yes, it's more towards the end of DOScember now, but I do have the later version of PC Task on this, version 4.4. Now, I'm not going to show you how to transfer files onto this in this video, but if you would be interested in seeing a wee video on how to set up an SD card for use on the PiStorm with Emu68, sure, let me know in the comments below and I'll try and pull something together. But let's get this back into the PiStorm, or into the Raspberry Pi to be more accurate, and wait till you see just how fast this goes. And yes, for those who are paying attention, that is a different power supply. I was having some issues with the other one. Very rarely I would ever see any problems with an Amiga power supply, but for whatever reason, it seems as if the voltage was dropping below the threshold for the Raspberry Pi. I was getting a little lightning spike symbol on the top right hand corner of the screen when trying to boot it up, and the Pi would just crash. So changed out to that power supply. The other one is only 300 milliamp, that one's 400, and with this everything seems to be fine. I wonder actually, is it just me adding the 2 floppy drives over here? Is that putting more load on the system and causing a bit of a volt drop? But here we are, back on the Amiga. So let's go into Files, PC Task 4. And you can see we have 2 executables again. PC Task Dynamic and PC Task Interpretive. It seems this time there is no option but to emulate a 486. Let's start on Dynamic. So floppy drive still DF1. I've renamed that from DOS to hard file. Dynamic buffer, just leave that on large. Not really sure what that does, to be honest with you. We can change it out to huge. Well, I suppose let's do that. Let's change that to huge because we have plenty of everything going spur on this Amiga. We'll emulate an FPU. We'll leave the graphics adapter on VGA. And in here now, what caught me out earlier when the machine switched from its HDMI RTG output to its RGB output was that there's various screen modes. You use these buttons here to cycle through them. And you need to set an appropriate RTG screen mode for each of these. And I've just tried to set modes that are as close as I can get to the resolution that PC Task is emulating. And we now have a total of 16 megabytes of RAM. So let's just start. You can see there it's emulating a 486. Still gives us that error. But if we jump into that benchmarks and run LM60 again, that looks an awful lot faster now, doesn't it, in terms of the video test. And it is now up to just below 1150 characters per millisecond. Interestingly though, the CPU and FPU scores are 0. Now on this disk, I've stuck a couple of extra benchmarks. So let's try check CPU. And that's interesting. CPU vendor is now seen as Cyrix. And internal CPU speed is 239.1 megahertz. Of course, all these various bits of software are going to get very confused because they're running on an emulated system. We also have sysinfo in here. And you can see here that sysinfo thinks that our processor is now a 486SX. But that's because it's seeing the Math coprocessor as a non-Intel 387. It does correctly identify the hard drive as 41 megabytes and the floppy disk as 720. And it has also correctly picked up the amount of memory we have. But if we run a CPU speed benchmark, I would tend to trust this more in terms of system performance. And there we are, it is sitting pretty steady at around 103. It's quite interesting that our processor down here being recognized as a 46SX, the clock speed of it is dancing about quite a bit. And then how about the other benchmark? 3D bench, if I could spell. Let's see if this thing will be able to now render graphics at a more reasonable speed. Well, I have to say that is pretty impressive so far. It is a bit jerky though. But yeah, I think this will give us a more realistic benchmark of the system performance. And 14.4 frames per second. That is certainly not bad for an old Amiga 500 plus. Yeah, okay, it's got a PiStorm in it, but you know what I mean. So what about PC Task Interpretive? Well, you'll notice this time that there's no option for the dynamic buffer or for the FPU. Everything else though is pretty much the same, so let's see how fast this runs. That seemed pretty quick. Let's jump into LM60. Right, that video test was more or less instant, and that seems to be confirmed because check out the speed of that video test. That is ridiculously faster than it was previously. But we are now also getting a CPU score, and that is 124 megahertz. What about our other benchmarks though? Let's try check CPU first. And that has crashed PC Task. Okay, well, at least this one has loaded. So processor 46SX, it's saying it at 51 megahertz this time. Everything else is correct again. Let's run our CPU benchmark. And that is considerably slower this time. So it's starting to look like the dynamic emulator is the way to go. For the sake of completeness though, let's just try 3D Bench. And yeah, it is quite a bit slower, isn't it? Down to 9.8 frames per second this time. So I think the way forward is to use the dynamic emulation. I think I will leave that one out. And just because we have all that speed to play with, I mean, it was running the emulator really well. I think what I'm going to do is scrap that 40 meg hard file that we have in there. I'll create one of, I don't know, 120 megabytes, 200 megabytes, whatever. There's any amount of space on the SD card in here. I'll set up a fresh installation of MS-DOS 5. That's the Commodore release of it. So rather fitting for this machine. Plus it was one of the only versions I could find on 720k disk format. And then on top of that, I think we should try and install Windows. Well, unfortunately, we've got a bit of a problem because no matter what I do with this Amiga 500, it always fails just at the start of the installation. Throws this unrecoverable error. Error reading file setup.ini. Returning to DOS, press enter to continue. So what I'm doing instead is I've stuck the SD card into the main PC and I'm just using WinUAE to set up the hard file because for whatever reason using this, well, it just seems to work. Well, I have been faffing about with this for far too long, but we are there, sort of. Let me show you what I've done. So PC Task 4. Previously I said PC Task Dynamic seemed to be the way to go because certainly in the synthetic benchmarks that one was coming out considerably faster. But if we boot it and launch into Windows, which I have to run in real mode, running it in any other mode, standard or enhanced, it just crashes. Well, you can maybe tell just by how slowly this is loading that PC Task 4 Dynamic doesn't run Windows all that well. But PC Task Interpretive well, it gets things done an awful lot quicker. So, now what? Well, I suppose we can have a game of solitaire. Have I just spent the last couple of days playing with this thing off and on to create nothing more than a Windows solitaire emulator? I hope not. I did also install Microsoft Works on this, and I had intended showing you this working, but we need Windows running in standard or enhanced mode to do so. Oddly enough, if I stick that SD card in here into the PC and launch everything under WinUAE, I can run Windows in the enhanced mode fine. But for whatever reason, in here on the PiStorm, the only way it will run without crashing is in real mode. But you'll probably notice a couple of other games in here. Well, that's the Monkey Island demo that we took a look at earlier. And this one is Wolfenstein 3D. Now, of course, all we're going to get is the PC speaker sounds. There's no sound card emulation in here, no AdLib or Sound Blaster or anything like that. But as you can see, it runs really well. Full speed, full screen. Just a bit of a shame about those sounds, but we can certainly live with it like this. Unfortunately, one of the limiting factors, for me anyway, with the Amiga 500 and just the double density disk drive, is getting software onto this. Now, even when I have things mounted on the PC under WinUAE, well, I can use high density disk images, but even just finding the disk images of the original DOS games is, well, not the easiest thing to do. Although, to be honest, I suppose I haven't really spent that much time looking for it. I have spent more time trying just to get this working. We still have the benchmarks in here, as you've seen earlier. And with our score there of 9.9 frames per second, then if we just run the likes of LM60 again, and while this benchmark is showing the 486 with a CPU clock of 256 megahertz, and telling us that the computer performs like 125 megahertz AT, well, I would more put the performance here, just based on my experience using it, I would put it in the round about a 25 to 30 megahertz 386, something like that. So yes, it's running DOS and it's running Windows. They're both running fine. You can certainly use it. If I could get it running in its standard or enhanced mode, you could even use it for MS Works. But, well, that's for another time. All in all though, I must say I am slightly disappointed. I did think it would have been slightly faster than what it is. Plus, you have no idea the amount of heartache I have had getting this working. So while it was fun playing about with this, I do think it's maybe better just to leave the PiStorm doing Amiga stuff. Especially when I can do awesome Amiga stuff like run AmiQuake.
Damn, those alien bastards are gonna pay for shooting up my ride.
So I'm going to go and have a game of this. And just enjoy my PiStorm for what it was meant to do.